Hey, everybody. I am super excited to welcome Douglas Wamsley onto the show. He has written a book that I'm very excited about that I have read once and am reading through a second time. He is a retired attorney who took his passion for polar exploration and the history of polar exploration and is a true historian in his own right. We're really excited to have him today. He's written a few books. We're going to circle back to his newest book at the end of this conversation, Big Wolf. But before we get to that, I just would like for I'd like for you to introduce yourself, Doug. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dive into our primary subject today, which is going to be your book, Polar Haze. But could you tell our listeners and our viewers just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I think you pretty much hit it on the head. I am a retired attorney. My original field of practice was in a large law firm, worked there for a few years, moved to a small firm. I was doing a little bit of everything from employment law to real estate law to house closings. And my real interest was in in-house corporate positions. So I did move to several corporations, through several corporations. The last of one, which was WebMD Health Corporation, which you may know as a health information website. And I was working there up to about the time of COVID. And then since then, I've been retired from full time practice and now really just devoting myself to research and writing on polar topics or polar people, so to speak.
It's
So
pretty
that's kind
exciting.
of how I got here.
That's great, and it's a great way to spend the retirement years,
Yes.
creating great things that you can share with the world. So I wanted to obviously my personal interest in Isaac Israel Hayes stems from the fact that we are distant relatives. And of course, I'm an avid reader of anything that has to do with polar exploration, but mostly it's been focused on Amundsen and Nansen, and the Norwegian explorers are kind of my favorites. But Isaac Israel Hayes, I actually, as interested in, I'm a 25-year musher of dog sled
Ah,
of sled dogs, but I did not know about Isaac Israel Hayes until I was in the National Art Museum in Washington D.C. and stumbled across Frederick Church's painting.
yes.
And when I started reading the description of and this was, I guess, about 10 years ago now, I started reading the description. I said, no kidding. So you wrote a book on Isaac Israel Hayes called Polar Haze. And I want to talk to you about him. But before we can talk about him, we have to talk about Cain. And before we can talk about Cain, we have
Yep.
to talk about Franklin. So tell us what was going on, what uh, what the Franklin expedition was, and how it set the stage for your
Sure.
book.
So, well, first of all, that was an interesting introduction, and I didn't make the Hayes connection until you just mentioned it. So that was very interesting. So, with it does actually start with Sir John Franklin. So, um, John Franklin was a British explorer in the 1800s. He had led two land expeditions, so called land expeditions, in the north of Canada, the first of which was a harrowing disaster. Several men died. There were allegations of cannibalism and murder. But in any event, he came back to England, and in 1845, the British had decided that we're finally going to solve the question of the Northwest Passage. And the Northwest Passage is the fabled water route from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean across the north part of America, which had been sought after for many years, principally by the British. So John Franklin led an expedition of two ships, the Erebus and Terror, left England in 1845 with 129 men. They reached the coast of Greenland, resupplied with equipment and food, and made their way westward across Smith Sound into Lancaster Sound, which is the entrance to the Northwest Passage. Before they actually entered the passage, though, they ran into a passing whaler. They assured the whaler that they had enough food supplies to make it for at least 5 years, and they could stretch it to 7 years. After that brief meeting in Lancaster Sound, John Franklin was never heard from again. So, over the course of several years, there was initially expeditions sent out to search for him and rescue him. And ultimately, it became a "What Happened to Franklin?" It was the international manhunt of the century in many respects. It was a big media event. It was carried by all the newspapers, and even in the United States, it was a rather interesting dilemma. What happened to these men in the Franklin expedition? As I mentioned, a number of expeditions went out. In the United States, actually, a man by the name of Henry Grinnell uh, became fascinated by the Franklin expedition and what had happened. He had become very friendly with Lady Jane Franklin, who was the wife of this lost explorer, and was prevailed upon to fund an American expedition in search of Franklin. And he was a retired shipping magnate. I think that's the right word, as opposed to magnet. And so, in his retirement, um, being very wealthy, purchased two ships. They were manned by crews from the United States Navy, and they set off in search for Franklin. They didn't find Franklin. This is in 1851, so it's now 6 years after Franklin has left. But what they did find was in the eastern entrance to the Northwest Passage, and a location called Beechy Island, they found three graves of Franklin's men, and deduced that they had overwintered there, but left suddenly with no record of where they went from there, which only added to this whole mystery of what happened to Franklin. So Kane came back to the States, and immediately went on a lecture tour to go on a second expedition in search of Franklin. And this is where Isaac Hayes kind of comes into the picture. So Henry Grinnell, again, purchased the ship. They went to go look for Franklin again. This is now 1853, so we're talking, almost 8 years from the time that they left England, and it's still unsolved. So Kane now goes off to a slightly different location than they had gone to last time. Interestingly, Kane's theory was that Franklin might be found in this so-called open polar sea, another fabled Arctic location. So the open polar sea is the concept that at some point in the far north, you're going to pass a barrier of ice, and suddenly it's going to open up into this Arctic oasis of an ice-free zone. Purely fanciful, but in 1850s, anything was possible. Mm-hmm. So, and he was going up on the Greenland coast, which was also not a location where anyone expected to find Franklin, but nonetheless, he pulled this together, and with a crew of about 18 men, went up north. One of the men who joined his expedition was Isaac Israel Hayes, actually Dr. Isaac Israel Hayes. And Hayes had actually joined literally from the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. He had graduated in May of 1845. And it seems a little bit odd that such a young, untested doctor would be, joining this expedition. But there were a couple interesting facts. Kane had graduated from the University of Pennsylvania several years before. He was also a doctor. And so he had a Philadelphia connection. Isaac Hayes had a very interesting background, and you would not think that he would be the most likely person to become an Arctic explorer. His family, your family actually, were related to Henry Hayes, who had an original land grant from William Penn. And so his family was basically farmers through several generations out in Chester County, Pennsylvania.
So I'll just interject here and tell you that shortly after, it was the late 1600s actually, when Jonathan Hayes, I'm actually Jonathan Hayes the fourth in our family lineage. Jonathan Hayes was a British naval sea captain who fell in love with a Quaker girl in Philadelphia, and sold his commission in the British Royal Navy and settled in Philadelphia and married this Quaker girl. So our part of the family is very closely tied to Philadelphia, and to the sea as well there. But we quickly, his family and ours were moving in different directions, and we were in Tennessee before Tennessee was a state. And then we, and my great great grandfather was a signing founder on a couple counties in West Tennessee, and one of the signing signers. But Captain Blackhawk Hayes was a contemporary of Isaac Israel Hayes, and he held his county for the North. He was a Unionist, and I know we'll talk about that
Yep.
later. But he was a loyalist to the Union and held his county for the North during the Civil War, helped to form a Union cavalry regiment. So they were both serving at the same time in different roles. But I just wanted, since you're at the Kane expedition right now, I wanted to ask you a few questions. So from what I understand, Isaac Israel Hayes explored he was the first, considered the first European man of European descent, non-indigenous, that
Right.
explored the east coast of Ellesmere Island. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, that's correct. And so Hayes joins the expedition as the doctor, and I think Elijah Kane believed that since he was also a doctor, between the two of them, they could handle the medical duties, but it would make Kane's life easier because he would have this other person with him who now you can understand why he didn't need to be a 5-year veteran practicing physician. In any event, Isaac Hayes, if you look at the letter that he sent to Kane when he volunteered for the expedition, he talked about his love of adventure. And so I'm sure Kane was captivated by the letter. He had gone to school at the same school that Kane had gone to. There was a Philadelphia connection. So Kane accepted him. And then when they actually got on the expedition, they worked their way up the Greenland coast, actually hauling the ship, warping the ship through the ice to where they ended up in Rensselaer Harbor on the northwest Greenland coast. And as you mentioned, Kane set off a couple exploring expeditions. One of which, the first of which, was up the Greenland coast past Humboldt Glacier, and William Morton and Hans Hendrik theoretically claimed to have seen this open polar sea.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some fact associated with the open polar sea that polynyas do exist up north, but not on the vast scale that they were talking about, which is this huge area of open water. In any event, the second expedition or exploring trek that Kane's men took was a sledge expedition by Isaac Hayes and another man named William Godfrey, who had kind of a sketchy background.
Mm-hmm.
He was picked up off the wharfs in New York before they left, and caused quite a bit of trouble for Kane. But for the moment, he was with Hayes on this trek across Smith Sound from Greenland to Canada. And as you mentioned, sets foot on Ellesmere Island, plants the Stars and Stripes there, and takes possession for the United States. It does actually present an interesting international law question, and I've seen that raised before. Obviously, there was not a huge issue made of it, but many years later, Ellesmere Island did become the focal point of territorial dispute, informal territorial dispute. But in any event, Isaac Hayes makes it across. Very rough crossing. Took 30 days. Used up most of his food. 30-foot hummocks, up and down, pulling sledges. Beating these dogs basically, just to get to the other side. And Godfrey, as Hayes later claimed, was so frustrated with it and wanted to turn back that he actually took a rifle shot at Hayes.
Mm-hmm.
So they make it to the other side, Ellesmere Island. They go briefly up the coast, turn around, and make their way back, and eating shoe leather as they arrive back at Kane's ship. So that they then settle in for their first winter. Things seem to be going fairly well. The next season comes around, spring comes around, and the men are getting a little bit antsy. Summer comes, and the ship is still stuck in the ice. They haven't found Franklin, of course, because Franklin is located someplace else, but we'll come back to that. Um, and a number of the men decide that they're not going to stay a second winter here. Things are looking pretty rough. Food's kind of low. We're starting to get a little weak. And a group of them approach Kane and say that we want to go home. And Kane, it's one of these interesting scenarios that is it a mutiny or not a mutiny. But in any event, Kane never believed that there was so many people dissatisfied that they would want to go home. So he put it up to a vote. Surprisingly, almost 11 of the 18 crew members said they wanted to go home. So Kane convinced two to stay, but essentially the expedition is now split into two halves. Hayes is in the withdrawing party. He wants to go home. He's not going to take his chances in another winter through the ice. So Kane gives them supplies.
So
They
this
take a boat.
and,
Sure.
and the supplies were running
Yes.
somewhat low by this point, right?
Yes. They really hadn't been able to accumulate enough supplies to last them through the winter. So it was getting a little bit sketchy, so to speak, with respect to that. They're running low on fuel. They were starting to break up the ship for warmth to heat themselves. So it wasn't a particularly pleasant situation. Um, in any event, this group of 8 men decide they're going to retreat 800 miles to Upernavik, which is on the Greenland coast. And remarkably, that withdrawing party, which was out for like 3.5 months, was one of the most remarkable trips in Arctic history,
Mm-hmm.
of which very little is known about because Kane suppressed it in his book. When Kane published his book, he was so disappointed with these guys that he left it out of his book completely. They left at a point and then they come back at a point, but nothing happened in between as far as Kane was concerned. But what had happened was this, incredible story of survival, misery, starvation, and some of the worst and best of people, which you'll see in a moment. So these 8 men go down. They literally get about 100 miles before they're frozen in. It's now October, November. Ice is everywhere. They're not going to make it anywhere south in a boat. They haul up in a crack in the wall, create a little cave for themselves, and basically are just sitting there to die. And they're unable to get any food. They're eating, trip de roche, lichen, like Franklin had done in his land expedition. They're suffering from diarrhea. And they're basically starving to death. But lo and behold, miraculously, the Inuit who happen to live in the area and were passing through are their salvation. They provide them some walrus meat, and so get them to the point where they've kind of recovered a little bit. As the story goes from the Hayes side, the Inuit believe that if they just waited these guys out, they could end up getting their guns and equipment and everything else because if they don't feed them, they're going to die. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's the story from the Hayes side.
Mm-hmm.
So, incredibly, Hayes, they invite them in, these Inuit men. They're all sitting around a pot stew, and Hayes pours in a vial of laudanum to knock them out. And so, sure enough, these men fall asleep, and Hayes and his group of 8 men run out, grab the dogs and the sledges, and start making their way back to Kane's ship. They don't get very far because they can't control the dogs. The dogs are loyal to their owners, so the dogs are kind of coming back. The Inuit wake up and they kind of meet each other halfway there. And at gunpoint, Hayes and his men force these Inuit to drive them back to Kane's ship. So they make this kind of miraculous trip all the way back. Hayes falls in the icy water at one point, ends up getting a few toes amputated. They make it back to Kane's ship, and Kane brings them in, but there's no brotherly love at this point. They pass a miserable winter, and to his credit, in the spring, Kane does deliver all of them to Upernavik. Another remarkable retreat from this ship, but with the help of the local Inuit at Etah, who supplied sledges, food, and helped haul these men and their supplies down to the open water. just to finish the story, Kane becomes a hero.
Mhm.
Um, he publishes his book Arctic Explorations. It's a bestseller. This another story is that when the pioneers traveled west, they took two books with them. One of them was the Bible, the other was Kane's Arctic Explorations, and he was truly a national hero, having survived these 2 years in the Arctic. And in fact, when he died a year later in 1857, his funeral was the largest funeral in the United States up until Abraham Lincoln died. He died in Havana. He came by ship back to the U.S., went up the Mississippi River to Ohio, and then back east to Philadelphia. This grand entourage of funeral procession. So that's the Kane expedition. They didn't find Franklin, but Hayes got his feet wet on this
And at
expedition.
what point would you say that uh, the quest, the search for Franklin stopped being the actual reason and kind of shifted to just being a pretense for this polar exploration?
My opinion is that from the start, Kane was well aware that he wasn't going to find Franklin in north of Greenland. So I think from the start, he well knew that, but it did generate support because the sympathy for Franklin at that point was at a high point. Henry Grinnell was prepared to offer up the ship. They were able to get donations. So I think that was kind of the driving force, was to get them going, using the Franklin expedition as kind of their goal.
And there was kind of this limbo period when they got back, right, where um, Hayes wanted to be a lecturer, which he became a lecturer. He wanted to speak out. He wanted to talk about the events that had transpired, but there was this really tense back and forth for a while, right, while they were waiting for Kane's
Yes,
book to come out.
yes. So when Kane came back, he basically, as Robert Peary did with the members of his expedition, sort of limited their ability to publish works until his work was out and to lecture. There was also a real concern on Kane's part and his family's part that some of these disgruntled members would publish something that was negative about Kane, because he was heavily criticized for his leadership on that expedition. The whole separation of the party didn't reflect well on him. John Wall Wilson, who was one of these dissatisfied crew members, had actually prepared a manuscript and was getting ready to publish it, and basically they quashed him from publishing it. Hayes actually did publish after Kane's death. So, that whole period goes on up through Kane's death. His book comes out. It's such a bestseller at that point. I think people lost track of the other men associated with the expedition. But Hayes did actually publish a book about the expedition called An Arctic Boat Journey. And it was about the retreating party from Kane's ship. And it's actually a very well written book. Completely forgotten, just like Isaac Hayes. It has been completely forgotten. A man, by the way, just as an aside, my interest in Hayes was not just from the Kane expedition. What was fascinating about Hayes is the fact that this Orthodox Quaker comes from an Orthodox Quaker family, generations of farmers, has suddenly decided that he wants to be an Arctic explorer, but then reinvents himself several times. He's a
Yes,
physician, explorer, hospital administrator, politician, statesman. We'll touch on those different things, but he was a fascinating figure. And if people forgot him from the Kane expedition, they were not even aware of all these other things that he
sure.
did in his lifetime.
Well, let me circle back because there's a big question mark in the actual Hayes expedition too, that I'll want to ask you about. But let's circle back to the men heading south, and I just want to ask you, as someone who's invested a lot of time into this, do you feel like that was a mutiny? I mean, obviously, technically, it was not, because he allowed the vote. Kane allowed the vote, and Kane allowed the men to leave, and even gave them some provisions. So technically, no. But do you feel that these men felt like they had no choice, and like where does this fall in your personal opinion as the
Oh,
author?
yeah, very interesting question. I've thought about this question long and hard, and I'm obviously biased, or you can at least think I'm biased because I wrote the biography of Hayes, who was on the seceding side. In my opinion, it was not a mutiny. Certainly, it wasn't a under threat of physical harm. Although there was some mention by Goodfellow that they're feared for some harm, but I think that the fear was more that they were going to be abandoned than that they were going to be physically overcome by these other men. I know Villarejo in one of the biographies of Cain mentioned, the threat of physical harm, but there was really no threat of physical harm. I do believe that Cain undertook to basically create the situation. Had he drawn a hard and fast line that says we're all staying, they probably all would have stayed, disgruntled and the like, but I think they would have stayed. Having given them the option of leaving, I really don't think you can fault the succeeding members from having done that. That's sort of where I come out on this. There's actually, and this is just an aside, but I found this fascinating. Leopold McClintock later wrote a book about the Franklin search, which we'll probably touch on in a minute. One of the members of his expedition was Carl Peterson, who was on the Cain expedition. And in his book, McClintock wrote that the Cain members, mutinied. And when Hayes found out about it, he wrote a letter to the publisher saying, if you publish that in the United States, I'm going to sue you for libel. And in fact, when the U.S. publication came out for that book, they modified the book,
Mm.
the language in the book. So there's two different accounts of the Cain expedition in McClintock's book. But in any event, to answer your question, I think it's fairly safe to say it wasn't a mutiny, although I think members of the Royal Navy may have felt differently.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I think that looking at the facts and as you pointed out, that he let them make the decision and gave them provision for it. Obviously, was not something that was done without his consent.
Right.
Is the way it appears.
That's
Um,
my feeling.
so then they come home, and it was 1860, right? That
Yes. So they now come home, and Cain has died, which has opened the door for Hayes because he's been standing in the background, letting Cain gain all this notoriety and fame from the expedition. But he suddenly dies. He had a chronic heart ailment, which he had his whole life. Um, in any event, after his passing, Hayes decides, okay, I'm now going to go north again. And in the interim, what's happened is that some information about Franklin's expedition has been found. So Dr. John Ray of the Hudson's Bay Company in 1857-58 is conducting a survey in the interior of Arctic Canada. He meets up with some Inuit who tell him, or they're able to piece together, he's able to piece together a story that some years ago, these men came across 40 white men who were in a very distressed state, trying to make their way south. That Ray obtained some relics from these men that clearly tie it to the Franklin expedition. And then these Inuit advised him that the next season they didn't find the men, they found the bodies of these men. So Ray comes back to England now in 1858 and lets the British government know that, he's found the fate of Franklin. And, so there's some, the positive is we've now at least gotten a little closure that, this expedition has ended in a disaster. But on the other hand, the stories of cannibalism that Ray brought back relating to these Franklin members didn't go over very well. Particularly Charles Dickens was inflamed by this concept that British sailors would engage in cannibalism. In any event, it didn't bring to a final closure the search for Franklin because what had actually happened to Franklin, no written records of the expedition were ever found to that point. And Lady Franklin was able to pull together one last expedition, the Voyage of the Fox by Sir Leopold McClintock, who in 1859 does find the area where Franklin's ships went down. That was another thing that was communicated to Ray, was that the ships were crushed in the ice. McClintock corroborates the stories when he meets the Inuit, interviews them, and lo and behold, he does find a written record relating to the expedition, that Franklin had died. A number of officers and crewmen had died to that point, and that the balance of these men were going to make this retreat southward, presumably to a Hudson Bay Company post, and presumably, now 15 years later, they're all dead. So that sort of brought closure to Franklin, 1859. So Hayes, who's now looking at, I want to go back north, but I can't use Franklin as my excuse,
Right.
has to come up with something else. And he came up with the idea that I'm going to search or reach the North Pole. And
Via
so
the open polar sea,
the
right?
and the open polar sea,
And
right?
this is a much tougher sale, for funding, because you don't have this, noble and time sensitive quest to go rescue someone. So he's having to make the sales pitch on the basis of science.
Yep. You hit the nail on the head. So the humanitarian purpose of this expedition is now lost, and it becomes a scientific expedition. And there had been a financial crisis and depression within the U.S. in 1857, severe. Even Henry Grinnell suffered, some crushing losses. Obviously, he was still wealthy, but he was not prepared to fund this expedition. Nor were any big donors willing to step up for what was viewed as simply a scientific expedition. Scientific institutions are great, but they don't usually come up with a lot of money. They may give you a scientist and a book to tell you how to collect specimens or take photographs, but they're not going to be, paying for this thing. So Hayes essentially sets forth in this grassroots campaign. That's what I call it, grassroots campaign. And becomes the modern polar fundraiser,
Mhm.
essentially. A model
The
adopted,
first of this kind, right?
first of its kind. Yeah, Robert
And I
Peary.
say that as someone, 3 or 4 years ago, and I know you don't know much about me, but 3 or 4 years ago, I did my first solo dog sled expedition of 280 miles as a fundraiser, for a monument that was being made. And I'm currently in the process of, doing a centennial expedition of the Serum Run, to Nome next year is the 100-year anniversary. So we're in the process right now of doing grassroots
Wow,
fundraising,
fabulous.
for a 750-mile expedition next year. So it's a lot of work, and
Yes.
I think it was the Australian explorer, Antarctic explorer, that said, that it's the worst and hardest part of polar exploration.
That's probably true. Well, and you sort of captured the point, because I was going to say the most difficult part of the expedition was and the most remarkable is the fact that it ever got off the ground. So here's Hayes, lecturing city to city, night after night. He doesn't have a full time job. He's lecturing to also pay his expenses. He benefited from the railroad system. I know it sounds funny, but he did literally. He could move from one town to the next by railroad, and $5 contributions, $10 contributions. There's a series of telegrams. You can just see the desperation as they're trying to get this thing mounted. William Parker Folk, who was a Philadelphia lawyer, was sort of his agent, and he was helping organize this thing and gathering the funds as Hayes was lecturing. And you can just see the stress and tension mounting in these telegrams saying, "Yeah, I'm going to Boston. I think I can get enough money." Um, Joseph Henry, who was with the Smithsonian, had provided some support on the scientific side. I'm sorry, and Beish from the from whatever his organization was, the Coast Survey, had provided equipment and everything else, and so he was on these um, telegrams too, and he's saying, "Look, if you don't have enough money, I don't want you to go out there and get yourself killed."
Mhm.
Um, you know, and it's like now, late May of 1860, they barely got enough money to get together. And he says, if you don't get this money by a certain date, you're not going to go. Tell me you're not going to go. So sure enough, he says, I got the money, I'm going. Whether he really did or not, I don't know.
Right.
But anyway, the total amount that he came up with was $20,000, which doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it was enough to buy a ship, outfit it,
Mhm.
and bring on a number of crew members for this attempt on what I call the first modern attempt to reach the North Pole. He goes up Smith Sound, basically following Kane's track, but doesn't go as far north as Kane did, and as a result, still it's a sailing ship. Doesn't get stuck in the ice like Kane does, but he does overwinter. It was one of the first expeditions to bring a camera to the Arctic. They actually came back with some photographs, which were produced as stereo views. They did a little scientific work. They were measuring the movement of glaciers, so they were trying to get some scientific work in there. August Suntag, who was the astronomer,
And
did
as
some work.
you're talking about with him outfitting the crew, and I believe this is something that I remembered from your book on him, is that one of the things that differentiated him from Kane, for example, was his respect and appreciation of the Inuit people and their abilities in the Arctic, and his willingness to embrace uh, their their ways of
Lifestyle.
a lifestyle
Yes.
of working in harmony with it, rather than this British European
Yep.
naval notion of conquering it and overpowering it, right?
Yes, yeah. You again. I agree with you completely. And what I would say is, I think Hayes did learn some of that from the Kane expedition. They did rely very heavily on the Inuit in North Greenland, who showed them how to drive sledges, how to drive dogs. What's the right clothing to wear? This wool clothing isn't going to cut it up here. Animal skins are the way to go. And so I think Kane took that and adopted it. I'm sorry, Hayes adopted that on his own expedition and was very willing to learn, how to build a snow hut, how to live off the land. And in that respect, he was very much like Dr. John Ray. And as you say, contrary to some of the British explorers who were kind of self-sufficient.
It
Um,
was one of the systems that it's one of the things that made Amundsen, for example, so successful, was he had a different mentality than the British of this conquest. He more would embrace and try to work with the elements, rather than to conquer
yep.
and oppose them.
Yeah, and the small expeditions rather than large ones are a lot easier to support in the field in the Arctic. So yes, I wholeheartedly agree that Hayes embraced the idea of learning from the Inuit people. Um, he then looks to make his North Pole attempt, fits himself up. And Hayes, I keep saying Kane, I mean Hayes. Hayes actually became an expert dog driver, which is another very difficult skill to master, as you know. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I give Hayes a lot of credit for having learned how to drive dogs successfully. So he then mounts his expedition to go to the North Pole. They take their sledges, they cross Smith Sound again, another difficult crossing. They go up the coast further than where Hayes had reached last time. And now you get to the point you mentioned, which is, how far did he really get?
Did
So,
he reach the furthest north
right.
for that time period? That's the big
Yeah,
question.
and the answer is I seriously doubt it. And it was questioned at the time. It wasn't a matter of him saying he was 5 or 10 miles short of where he thought he was. Hayes claimed that he was at as far as Lady Franklin Bay, the south end of Lady Franklin Bay, which is very far up on the Ellesmere Island coast. If you look at his original field diary, from the time he landed on the Ellesmere Island coast to the time he went up to his furthest north, so to speak, it was a matter of days, and he was traveling, 5 to 6 miles a day. You could simply add the miles, and it doesn't add up.
There just wasn't enough time for him to have
Nope.
gone as far as he claimed to have gone.
No, not enough. It was sort of period. You might argue Peary had the same issue, but A very similar situation. Uh, so speaking of Peary, we'll talk about Peary in a moment, because Peary adopted a number of Hayes's methods. So anyway, Hayes comes back to his ship, unsuccessful on his North Pole attempt, but overall he's gone a little further north than he thought, and he comes back to the United States and pulls into the harbor in Boston, and nobody cares, right? The Civil War is
Civil War is
raging,
now,
right?
right?
The Battle of Bull Run has just occurred. Thousands of American citizens are dying. The last anybody wants to hear about a North Pole expedition that failed is, there it's at the bottom of the list. But to his credit, Hayes, the medical man, volunteers to serve the Union cause. And this, I actually believe, is where the Quaker aspect of his background comes in.
Mm-hmm.
He was a medicine man. He did want to help. Um, and he volunteers to join the Union Medical Corps. And through pulled a few strings, Abraham Lincoln, not by virtue of Hayes's fame, but by virtue of Kane's fame. The letter that was written said, "This is, Isaac Hayes. He was with Kane, the great Kane. You should take him and give him a, good position." So he manages to become the surgeon in charge of Satterley Hospital. And as you know, if you've read the book, this was kind of the untold story of Hayes, which is Hayes became the director. So he was in charge of every aspect of the hospital: medical, clinical, administrative,
It's
military,
construction too, right?
and the construction. So Hayes was involved with the construction of the hospital to its destruction at the end of the Civil War. He was there from start to finish. It was the largest hospital in the Union Army. At that time, it may have been one of the largest hospitals in the world. It could handle a capacity of up to 4,000 soldiers, with the ability to expand to another 1,000, so 5,000 soldiers. And there were periods after Bull Run and Second Bull Run and after Gettysburg where the hospital was actually taxed to its fullest. Hayes, commendable service as the administrator of that hospital, received praise from the Surgeon General. So when the war starts, there aren't any general hospitals. They're kind of making this up as they go along. We're using jails, hotels, asylums, makeshift buildings for hospitals. But, they have this concept now of permanent hospitals, and Satterley Hospital was the biggest. Surgeon General Hammond comes down, inspects it several times, and he refers to it as the model general hospital. He was so impressed with it and how it was run. Every soldier that came in was given a bath, given clean clothing, given good food. Still before the germ theory was known, but they
Sure.
understood cleanliness makes a difference. And contrary to what you think about, Civil War, wounded soldiers having their limbs
Butchery.
chopped off, they went out of their way to avoid amputations. And you can see the orders that say it requires 3 surgeons and Dr. Hayes to sign off on any amputation. It was very, very. They were actually probably less likely to do an amputation than more likely.
Mm-hmm.
And then just in terms of disease as well, dysentery, typhoid, which were far more deadly than battle wounds. They tended to minimize it through the use of clean water and good food. So all in all, he does a great job at the hospital here. Hospital gets torn down at the end of the war. Thank you very much.
So
And
he reinvents himself yet again, right?
reinvents himself. Yes. Again, just a quick aside. If you go down to West Philadelphia, where the hospital was, it's part of it covered 2 blocks square radius. It was like 14 acres, but there's a little park there, Clark Park. And after the war, they put a monument up there, and the monument commemorated Satterley, who was named after the hospital, as opposed to the man who was involved with the hospital from start to finish. I thought it was a little ironic about how this man was forgotten. So the war ends. Isaac Hayes is now got to, what am I going to do now? Right. I'm out of the army. I know about this polar exploration stuff. He decides he's going to move to New York, moves to New York, and becomes a freelance writer and lecturer, professional. Um, Very difficult way to make ends meet.
Mm,
But he, gets by for a few years here and there. He does become rather prolific. And again, one of the other, less known facts about Hayes is that he did publish 5 books, wrote 40 articles, and really kept the Arctic in the forefront of the
mm.
public through, these popular magazines and his books. Um,
And you said he really contributed to a method of polar exploration that was adopted by others subsequently that
yes,
were in turn then more successful in
Yes,
his
and
West.
and this was kind of, you asked me about legacies at one point. We talked about legacies, and I think if one of the legacies of Isaac Hayes is that he did create the blueprint that was used particularly by Robert Peary in reaching the North Pole. So the concept of Smith Sound and Ellesmere Island as the preferable route to the North Pole was adopted wholeheartedly by Peary in his 3 attempts to get to the pole, and ultimately, most people believe he did. But the use of a steamship to travel as far north as possible in Smith Sound was a Hayes suggestion. The adoption of Inuit techniques, but not only Inuit techniques, but the use of the Inuit. No one, exploitation is probably the, not too strong a word for what Peary did with the Eskimo, with the Inuit at Etah. At one point, I think there was like every available Inuit man was used to support Peary's
It does,
expeditions.
yeah. It didn't matter whether they had dogs to actually survive the next year, as long as Peary had the dogs that he
Right.
needed to
Exactly.
reach
Yeah.
the
No,
North
he took it to an unbelievable length. But in my mind, the modern search for the North Pole and the methods to get there, Isaac Hayes really deserves some credit for that. Um, there's another interesting aside, and I think I mentioned it in the book, which I thought was fascinating. There's this, one of the most famous stories about Peary was that when on one of his trips up the Ellesmere Island coast to Fort Conger, which is where Greeley had wintered, well, much later, he had frostbite on all 10 of his toes, and he
Mhm.
was sitting there with these gangrenous toes, laid up in a bunk in Fort Conger, and disappointed he couldn't do more, and he scratches on the wall, "Find a way or make one," in Latin,
Yes,
the
yes.
Seneca slogan, and it became like this. Nothing was more associated with Peary than this "find a way or make one," this crazy, determined man who's going to get to the pole. In
Except,
Isaac Hayes's journal,
uh-huh.
it's not in his book, oddly, but in his journal, as he set off on his North Pole trip, he says, "I took my sledge flag, and we set off with 3 cheers, and my flag, find a way or make one, on the way to the North Pole." And
Unreal.
I have no doubt that Peary saw that
Of course.
diary at the American Geographical Society and said, "What a great motto to take to get to the North Pole." So anyway, just an aside. um, so anyway, he's now in New York, trying to make ends meet. He did actually, as you mentioned, he did become an acquaintance of Frederick Church. The story goes that Church gave him drawing lessons, and he did make some sketches. And Church created this, fabulous, great picture, the
Mm,
aurora borealis of Hayes's ship under the midnight sun, which I guess is in the Smithsonian. He also made the acquaintance of William Bradford, the marine artist. And Bradford invited him to join an expedition that Bradford was mounting to Greenland. Um, so this is late 1860s. And Hayes wasn't going as an explorer; he was going as an advisor. And it became, for Bradford, it was a wonderful expedition because um, Bradford had been to Labrador, had done some paintings in Labrador, but he really wanted to go up to the frozen north and, paint these icebergs and, visit these areas that, Kane had written about. So he takes Hayes with him, who turned out it was a great idea because Hayes, in my mind, helped the success of that expedition because Hayes knew all the administrators in the Greenland settlements. He paved the way for Bradford to make this trip to North Greenland. And from that expedition, Bradford had some of his best paintings, but he also created, you probably know, the huge elephant folio of photographs. So
Hmm.
Bradford took with him two photographers, Dunmore and Critcherson, from a Boston studio, and they took these wonderful photographs of icebergs, bears, and basically ships in the ice. And it became, this fabulous book that was purchased by subscription, including the Queen. And to this day, it's one of the most elegant and earliest, books on travel photography. Wonderful photographs. Anyway, so Hayes now comes back to New York. He's still kind of making his way around, lecturing and writing, and decides that he's going to reinvent himself one more time. He goes to a uh, rally for New York politician, and someone kind of pushes him and says, "Why don't you run?" And he says, "Okay, I think I will." So he runs for the New York State Assembly, 1876, from a district in New York City, and he wins by a lot. He did still have name recognition. He wins by a lot and served 6 years in the New York State legislature. But he served extremely well. And this again goes to, I think, the Quaker background. It was sort of lost at times. I would say he was never a highly religious person, but I think it comes back out a little bit as he's a New York State legislator.
And that does seem. I don't know about you, but as I get older, I see there's this propensity. I see it. I've seen it with my father, and now I'm starting to see it with myself. That we always seem to find our way back to our
Yeah,
roots as we get older, and it
yeah.
seems that that's what's happening with
I
Hayes.
think that happened here. He was actually disowned by his meeting, and I was never quite sure whether it was about 18, maybe the 50s, late early 1860. There's a reference to him being disowned, and I never really understood whether that was because he simply wasn't attending or because there was his involvement with the Civil War. He was still involved with the war, and obviously they were quite pacifist. So there was sort of a break there,
Mhm.
which I never was able to quantify that much. But in any event, he now is a New York State Assemblyman, and you can see his charitable approach to things. So he introduces bills for the funding of an asylum, for foundling homes, homes for orphans, public reading rooms, compulsory education for school children, something we take for granted today. But he was concerned with, getting these children off the street so they didn't become street urchins.
Mhm.
And compulsory education was the way to do it. So you can see there's a list of what I call charitable um, um, bills that he had introduced over the years, some of which got passed, some of which didn't. He also became a strong advocate for the commercial supremacy of New York State and New York City in particular, which is surprising given that he was from Philadelphia. But his two biggest legislative victories, so to speak, were the first Hudson River Tunnel. So the Hayes
Mm.
Bill, which
Okay.
was finally passed after several years and a lot of oppositions, approved the construction of a tunnel, subaqueous tunnel, I guess they called it, from New York, from New Jersey to New York under the Hudson River, which we take for granted today.
Mhm.
To that point, the trains would come up and they'd end in like Jersey City in New York. They'd have to take ferries and get over. So it was actually, a real pain in the neck. Um, there was a lot of opposition because on the New York side in particular, there were questions about, well, property ownership underneath homes and buildings. And so this legislation settled that issue. Unfortunately, Hayes didn't live to see it because it wasn't until like 1908 that they finally finished the construction of the tunnel. But he was instrumental in having that happen.
And
And the other commercial, there were a bunch of small ones, but the other important commercial one was the abolition of tolls on the Erie Canal. Again, it became kind of a windfall for the state of New York. Once tolls were abolished, it increased substantially the flow of goods into New York or across New York. So anyway, he's now the seasoned legislature. Didn't make a lot of money as a legislator. Still lecturing on the side, and one night, 1881, he goes up, has dinner with a friend of his, and has a heart attack and dies. And never married. He was a bachelor. His family, brother, and at that point his father was still alive. Get a call at 4 a.m. saying,
this was he was 49 years old at the time.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah, young man.
As a strange aside, that's exactly how old I'll be on my expedition.
Well, I'm
let's
sure
hope that
I'm sure you'll last far longer. Anyway, so he dies virtually penniless. So his family comes up from Pennsylvania, and it's a sad story. They go into his apartment, which had been filled with artifacts and from all his Arctic trips and everything else. There was an article in one of the papers about how he had bearskin rugs and narwhal tusks all over his apartment. They come in, the apartment's stripped bare because he hadn't been able to pay his rent, and the landlord confiscated all his personal belongings.
You mean to tell me that politicians back then didn't become millionaires by being
no,
politicians?
not all of them. Well, one of the things I should add, and actually you sort of raised it in my mind, when Hayes ran as a New York assemblyman, he ran on an anti-Tammany platform. At the time, Tammany Hall was really controlling New York City and I guess to a certain extent the state. But the Tammany Hall influence was everywhere, and he opposed a lot of legislation relating to the city that provided for no-show jobs and a lot of other things. And he did actually create a number of enemies from the Tammany Hall people. So he wasn't, to his credit, he wasn't taking advantage of his position as a politician for personal gain. That's certainly for sure.
Yeah, that speaks to his roots as well. I think
Yes.
for
Yeah.
sure.
There's that great inconsistency, though, that the man
Sure.
who could lie about how far north he got, on the other hand, could be, this very charitable
Yeah.
person. So I never could quite figure that out. But I think
Sure.
the, it's another interesting point. The desire for fame and wanting to prove himself to his backers, particularly William Parker Folk and Bayshore, who put so much effort into this thing. I think he felt that he had to come back with something, and I think that
Yeah.
caused him to stretch himself.
And that's and it's probably one of the things that attracted you to him. I'll say, but my first education wasn't in biology, which was my second education. My first education, like Hayes's, was in theology. I studied theology at Milligan College in Milligan, Tennessee, and my father is a bishop, and so I grew up in that. And one of the things I've always loved about the heroes in the Bible is that you don't just get the good things about them. You get to hear the bad parts of their stories
Right.
and the horrible things that they did. You've got David, who is this great warrior, poet, king, but he was also killing him, putting a man on the front of the battle line to take his wife so that he could have his wife. And all these horrible things. And so I think it just when we only hear the good about any polar explorer, anybody, it really lessens their value to us. But when we see that these were faulted people, it doesn't make them evil or good, but they're faulted people. Then they're more we can relate to them a bit
Yeah,
better.
they're more human. No, I agree with you, and I've always tried to take a balanced approach with respect to biographical works in particular, because I think sometimes authors and writers can get so involved in the subject that
Yeah,
they become advocates for the
sure.
subject, and I worked very hard, and I still do work very hard to try and take an objective view. Towards the subject, because there wasn't all positive stuff. So
So let me ask you this. We'll start to wrap up here, but before we
mhm.
do, I would like to have you back to speak about your new book. So before we move on, that's Polar Haze. That's what we've been talking about
Yes.
over the last hour. The book Polar Haze. It's available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. And if Doug, if you'd like to share a specific place where you'd like for people to get the book, you can do that. But before we wrap up, you've got a new book out that you're promoting, and it looks like another very interesting, colorful character.
Yeah.
And so, if you could just give us a little teaser blurb about
Sure.
what that is, and then I'll invite you back within the next couple of
Okay.
months. And we'll just focus on that.
Yes. No. Thanks very much for the plug. Um, my next book, which is out, just out recently, is about another polar explorer who was, like Isaac Hayes, a Renaissance man. His name was, I call him Lieutenant Frederick Schwatka, a man who made remarkable strides in polar exploration, but had a fascinating career both before and after his polar journeys. And again, um, I enjoy. You mentioned early on Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen, Peary. Those are great stories. People know those stories. Those are, I don't need to retell those stories. The interesting stories to me are the ones where you go back to the primary sources, and no one's looked at
Right.
Schwatka's journal from this expedition, or the letters when he was writing home from the frontier. To me, that's
That's
kind of
gold.
the interesting.
That
Yeah,
stuff is gold for someone like you. Yeah.
yeah, no, the obscure, forgotten figure who's contributed something is right up my alley. So Frederick Schwatka is probably in that category. Most people have never heard of Frederick Schwatka, but if you read the book, you'll find that he was a fascinating 19th century figure.
All right. Well, so what we're
So,
going to do is I'm going to say to everyone that's watching or listening, order Polar Haze, read it. But what you might want to do is go ahead and order Big Wolf first, and read that right
yes.
away, so that you can be ready for the next time that Doug gets together with me and we have another conversation. Doug, I want to thank you for your time. This has been awesome, and we're looking forward to having you back. And I'm going to tell our listeners also, don't try to find you on social media. Because usually I tell people you can follow our interviewer today on social media. Man, you are a hard man to track
Yes,
down,
I'm as obscure as the people I write about. I would agree.
but definitely definitely check out his
They
book.
should contact you if they want to reach me.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, thank you, sir.
Okay,
Thank you very
thank you.
much. All right, God bless. Have a good one.
Okay.